The room was small. The light was fading, a weak amber leaking through half-closed blinds. On the wall, an old guitar leaned like a witness to exhaustion. Elliott Smith sat beneath it, surrounded by coffee cups, torn lyric pages, the quiet chaos of someone who had turned sound into confession. Outside, Los Angeles was loud as always, but inside that Echo Park apartment, the silence had already started rehearsing its role. When the music finally stopped, it wasn't an ending. It was the softest kind of surrender. October 21st, 2003. In an apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors breathing, where notebooks filled with lyrics covered every surface, a 34-year-old man made a choice that no one would ever fully understand. 2 stab wounds to the chest, a note that read, "I'm so sorry, love, Elliott. God forgive me." And a silence so profound it still echoes through every whispered song, every quiet confession, every person who ever felt too much and said too little. The world learned slowly. No breaking news, no immediate headlines. Just friends calling other friends, voices breaking over phone lines, the word spreading through the indie music community like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. By evening, impromptu memorials had appeared outside clubs in Portland, New York, Los Angeles. Candles, flowers, handwritten lyrics, people sitting in circles playing his songs badly because their hands were shaking too much to get the chords right. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled it possible suicide, but left the case open. The wounds were too deep, too precise. The angle was wrong. There had been an argument with his girlfriend moments before. The knife had no fingerprints. Every detail raised more questions than answers. But perhaps the real mystery wasn't how Elliott Smith died. It was how he lived as long as he did, carrying that much sadness, turning it into something so beautiful it hurt to listen to. Here's what haunted everyone who heard the news. How does someone write songs that save other people's lives while unable to save his own? How does a voice that quiet reach that many people? And why, when Elliott Smith finally got everything musicians dream of, record deals, Oscar nominations, critical acclaim, did it feel like watching someone drown in recognition, suffocating under the weight of being seen? The obituaries called him the poet of indie rock and listed his albums, his Oscar nomination, his influence. But they missed something essential. They missed the fact that Elliott Smith wasn't trying to be sad. He was trying to be honest. That his whisper wasn't weakness but precision. That he'd spent his entire life learning to speak so quietly that only people who were really listening could hear him. And there were millions of people listening, desperate for someone to articulate the kind of pain that has no name, the kind of loneliness that exists even in crowded rooms. His death certificate listed possible suicide. But those who knew him understood there was something more complicated happening. Not just depression. Elliott had been depressed for years and kept creating through it. This was different. This was the sound of someone who'd run out of songs, someone who'd given everything he had to the music and found himself empty, standing in an apartment with nothing left but silence. And for Elliott Smith, silence was the only thing more terrifying than being heard. Before we understand how Elliott Smith died, we need to understand how he lived. And to understand how he lived, we need to go back to before the songs, before the sadness became famous, before anyone knew that whisper could be louder than screaming. Back to Omaha, to a childhood that taught him early that the world wasn't safe, that love could hurt, that sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear into something, anything, that makes sense when nothing else does. Omaha, Nebraska, 1969. Stephen Paul Smith was born into a family that looked normal from the outside, middle class, suburban, the kind of place where lawns were mowed and Christmas lights went up on schedule. But inside, things were breaking in ways that don't show up in family photos. His parents divorced when he was young, his mother remarried, and Stephen, not yet Elliott, that would come later, Learned early that home wasn't necessarily where you were safe. He never spoke much about his childhood, not directly. But the songs told the story for anyone who knew how to listen. Difficult stepfather, feeling invisible, learning to be quiet so quiet you almost disappear, finding that the smaller you made yourself, the less you got hurt, but also finding that if you made yourself small enough, you might vanish entirely, and then who would you be? He learned early that quiet could be armor. His refuge was music. Guitar first. His mother's acoustic, which he taught himself to play at 9 years old. Fingers too small for the chords, but determined to make something beautiful out of the noise in his head. Then piano. Then songwriting, which started as a way to organize his thoughts and became the only way he knew how to tell the truth. "I started writing songs because I couldn't talk," he said once, in a rare moment of openness. "I'd try to say what I felt and nothing would come out right. But if I sang it, if I put it to chords, suddenly it made sense. Music was the only language I was fluent in." He tuned his guitar the way other people tuned apologies. Could this early need for music as translation, as the only safe way to speak, have been both his salvation and his curse? By high school, Stephen had become someone his classmates barely noticed. Quiet kid. Wore the same clothes every day. Sat in the back. Got good grades but never raised his hand. The kind of person who exists in the margins, who you might see in old yearbook photos and think, "I don't remember them at all." But he was watching. Always watching. Taking notes on human behavior like an anthropologist studying a species he didn't quite belong to. He understood loneliness not as isolation, but as a kind of transparency. Being surrounded by people who look right through you as if you're made of glass. He moved to Portland, Oregon for college, escaping Texas where his family had relocated. Escaping the memories, escaping himself. Portland in the late 1980s was gray and wet and full of other people who didn't quite fit anywhere else. It was perfect. He formed a band called Heat Miser with friends. Loud, distorted, angry music that was everything Elliott wasn't. "We were trying to sound like we mattered," he said later. "Like we could make enough noise to prove we existed." Heat Miser had a following. They were good in the way bands are good when they're young and hungry and convinced that volume equals legitimacy. They played shows at Satyricon and La Luna, Portland venues where the floors were sticky with spilled beer and the crowds were generous with bands that played loud enough to drown out thought. Elliott played guitar, contributed songs, did his part. But anyone watching closely could see the discomfort, the way he'd shrink back from the microphone, the way his body language suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The problem was authenticity. Heat Miser's aggression felt borrowed, like they were trying on someone else's anger and hoping it would fit. For Elliott, who'd spent his entire childhood learning to disappear, suddenly being loud felt like another kind of lying. Just in a different register. The band was getting attention, his friend and Heat Miser bandmate Neil Gust recalled. But Elliott seemed to be suffering more the more successful we got. Like every show was costing him something we couldn't see. Behind the scenes, Elliott was writing different songs. Quiet songs. Songs that sounded nothing like Heat Miser's wall of distortion. He'd record them alone, late at night when his roommates were asleep, using a cheap 4-track recorder and whatever instruments were lying around. These weren't demos for the band. They were something else entirely. Confessions he couldn't make in person. Truths he could only tell when no one was listening. A friend heard these recordings and insisted Elliott release them. He resisted at first. They were too personal, too naked. They weren't meant for public consumption. But eventually, almost reluctantly, he agreed. He compiled the best songs, pressed a small run of CDs on Cavity Search Records, and called the album Roman Candle. It was 1994. Elliott was 25 years old, and he'd just released one of the most devastatingly intimate debut albums in indie rock history. But something wasn't right. The louder the band got, the more uncomfortable Elliott became. It wasn't authentic, it wasn't true. He realized something fundamental. People talk loud when they want to sound strong. But he wasn't strong. He was fragile, and pretending otherwise felt like another kind of lying. So he started recording songs alone, in his bedroom on a 4-track recorder that cost less than most people spend on dinner. Just voice and guitar. So quiet you had to lean in to hear. Songs about depression and addiction and the quiet desperation of trying to be normal when normal feels like a costume that doesn't fit. The songs on Roman Candle weren't just quiet. They were skeletal. Stripped down to the absolute essentials. Voice, guitar, sometimes 2 guitar parts finger-picked in counterpoint, creating melodies that intertwined like conversations between 2 parts of the same broken person. The production was so minimal you could hear fingers sliding on strings, breath between phrases, the creak of a chair as Elliott shifted weight. A no-name #1 opened the album with finger-picking so delicate it sounded like it might shatter if you listened too hard. Elliott's voice entered, double-tracked, harmonizing with himself, creating the uncanny effect of someone comforting their own ghost. The lyrics were devastating in their directness. Admissions of self-harm, of substance abuse, of the specific loneliness that comes from being unable to connect even with people who love you. Condor Ave followed, and it was here that Elliott's genius for melody revealed itself. The guitar line was mathematically simple but emotionally complex, and his voice, thin, fragile, utterly sincere, carried lyrics that cut like glass. I don't know what to do with your clothes or your letters. It'll make a whisper out of you. Critics who heard Roman Candle didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't lo-fi as aesthetic choice, the way Sebadoh or Pavement were using tape hiss and distortion as texture. This was lo-fi as necessity, as the only way Elliott could make these songs exist without destroying their intimacy. Producing them properly with studio sheen and professional clarity would have been like putting museum glass between the listener and the art. He called these recordings Roman Candle and released them in 1994 on a tiny indie label that paid him in copies. No one expected anything. It was just Elliott Smith, the quiet guy from that loud band, making music that sounded like it was recorded at 3 a.m. when everyone else was asleep. But something about those songs cut through. The honesty, the vulnerability, the sense that you were hearing someone's actual thoughts, unfiltered, as if Elliott had forgotten to perform and was just existing. In a world of irony and posturing, where indie rock had become as calculated as pop music, Elliott Smith sounded dangerously real. He whispered because screaming had already been done, because quiet was the last unoccupied territory, because when you speak softly, people have to stop and listen. They can't just let your voice wash over them. They have to choose to hear you. And for Elliott, that choice mattered more than reaching everyone. He wanted to reach the people who would understand. His second album, Either Or, came in 1997 and changed everything. Not commercially, it sold modestly. But culturally, spiritually, it became a secret handshake among people who felt too much. If you knew Elliott Smith, if you played his songs at 2 a.m. while staring at your ceiling, you were part of a community of the quietly broken. People who'd learned to function while falling apart. People who smiled in public and cried in their cars. The album was recorded the same way as Roman Candle, cheaply, quickly, intimately. But Elliott had grown as a songwriter. The melodies were more sophisticated, the arrangements more layered, his confidence as a vocalist more evident. Where Roman Candle had felt like eavesdropping on someone's private pain, Either Or felt like Elliott had decided to speak directly to you, to look you in the eye and tell you things he couldn't tell anyone else. The opening track established the album's thesis, a meditation on ambivalence, on being caught between 2 equally unbearable options. Stay in pain or medicate it away, be alone or risk connection, keep living or stop. Elliott didn't offer answers. He just documented the paralysis of having too much insight into your own dysfunction. What made Either Or special wasn't just the songwriting. It was the intimacy of the recording. You could hear Elliott breathing between words. You could hear the room he was recording in, the slight echo that suggested small space and hard surfaces. Modern production techniques work to eliminate these ambient sounds to create a pristine sonic space where only the music exists. Elliott did the opposite. He left in the mistakes, the room noise, the humanity. It made you feel like you were sitting in the room with him while he worked through his pain in real time. Portland's indie community embraced the album immediately. Elliott started playing solo shows at small venues, 30, 40 people max, sitting on the floor, so quiet you could hear Elliott's fingers on the strings. He'd play the songs hunched over his guitar, eyes closed, barely acknowledging the audience. No stage banter, no jokes, just songs one after another until he'd emptied himself of everything he needed to say. People who saw those early shows described them as religious experiences. Not in a grandiose way, but in the sense of witnessing something sacred, something true. It felt, one fan remembered, like Elliott was conducting surgery on himself in public and we were being allowed to watch. It was uncomfortable and beautiful and you couldn't look away. The songs were deceptively simple. Just voice, guitar, maybe some piano. But the melodies were intricate. The lyrics were poetry, and Elliott's voice had this quality of wounded beauty, like he was singing from the bottom of a well, and somehow the acoustics made it more clear, not less. He made sadness sound like something you could live through. The album spread slowly, passed from friend to friend, dubbed onto cassette tapes and burned onto early CDRs, shared like contraband. This was pre-streaming, pre-social media virality. If you wanted people to hear Elliott Smith, you had to physically give them a copy and say, "You need to hear this." And people did. College students, other musicians, writers. Anyone who'd ever felt like they were performing normalcy while falling apart inside. Word reached bigger indie labels. Kill Rock Stars offered him a deal. So did Domino. But Elliott was wary of success, suspicious of what it might do to the work. He'd seen other indie artists signed to majors, get studio budgets and marketing campaigns, and lose whatever made them special in the first place. The production would get slicker. The songs would get safer. The honesty would curdle into performance. He stayed with Kill Rock Stars for his next album, maintaining creative control, keeping the budget small and the pressure minimal. He just wanted to make music that felt true. Everything else, the business, the interviews, the possibility of fame, felt like a threat to that truth. Critics noticed, other musicians noticed, and then, impossibly, Hollywood noticed. Gus Van Sant, directing Good Will Hunting, needed a song for a pivotal scene. He'd heard Either Or and knew immediately Elliott Smith was the sound he wanted. Not the sound of Boston or math genius or working-class struggle, but the sound of someone smart enough to see all their options and sad enough not to care. Van Sant called Elliott and asked if he had any songs that might work. Elliott sent him a new composition, a song about the peculiar depression that comes from getting what you wanted and realizing it doesn't fix anything. The movie was a massive hit. The song was hauntingly perfect. And suddenly Elliott Smith, who'd spent his entire career hiding in small clubs and bedroom recordings, was nominated for an Academy Award. Was the success he was about to achieve truly worth the price, being forced into a spotlight he'd spent his entire life avoiding? The 1998 Academy Awards. Elliott Smith stood backstage in a white suit that didn't quite fit, holding his guitar like a life preserver, watching Celine Dion and Madonna and Trisha Yearwood perform their nominated songs with full orchestras and backup dancers and production values that cost more than his entire album budget. Then it was his turn, just him, just the guitar. No orchestra, no dancers, no safety net. He walked onto that stage in front of Hollywood's elite. People in gowns worth more than his yearly rent. people who made careers out of being larger than life, and he did the only thing he knew how to do. He made himself smaller, hunched over his guitar, barely looked up, sang like he was alone in his bedroom, like there weren't millions watching, like vulnerability was still a choice he could make. He looked like a ghost who'd wandered into a dream too bright to survive. His voice shook, his hands trembled on the frets. He missed a note, corrected, kept going. It was imperfect, it was uncomfortable, it was the most real thing that happened all night. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that comes after something true has been said and people need a second to remember how to breathe. Then the applause started, swelling, people standing. Not because he'd entertained them, but because he'd reminded them what honesty looked like. Backstage afterward, a journalist asked how he felt. "It was the first time I felt seen," Elliott said, his voice barely audible. "And I didn't like it." He lost the Oscar to Celine Dion. Some said he seemed relieved. Like losing meant he could go back to being invisible, go back to the shadows where he understood the rules, where success didn't feel like drowning in attention he never asked for. But it was too late. Elliott Smith was famous now. And fame, he was about to learn, doesn't respect people who don't want it. Fame found him like a searchlight, blinding, not illuminating. The years after the Oscars should have been golden. His next album, XO, was released by DreamWorks, a major label, real budget, professional production. Critics loved it. It sold well by indie standards. Songs showed Elliott could make bigger, fuller music without losing the intimacy that made him special. But something was wrong. You could hear it if you listened carefully. The songs were sadder, more desperate. The music sounded like someone drowning in plain sight while people applauded the performance. He didn't crave attention, he suffered it. Elliott was using heroin, not recreationally, medicinally almost, using it to quiet the noise in his head, to make the world feel far enough away that it couldn't hurt him. He'd struggled with addiction before, but this was different. This was methodical, deliberate. Like he'd decided that the only way to keep making music while famous was to chemically remove himself from fame's effects. His friends worried. His label worried. But Elliott was functional, still writing, still recording, still touring, just also using. The two things existed in parallel, like he'd split himself into public Elliott who showed up and private Elliott who was falling apart. Figure 8 came in 2000, his most ambitious album yet. Produced by John Bryan, recorded at Abbey Road Studios, featuring string sections and full band arrangements. It should have been his breakthrough into real commercial success. Instead, it felt like a goodbye letter. Every song seemed to be about endings, failure, the impossibility of connection. One track was as close as Elliott ever got to explaining the black hole at his center. The sense that no amount of success or love or recognition could fill the absence where his self-worth should have been. The tours got harder. He'd show up late or not at all. When he did perform, he'd sometimes stop mid-song, apologize, start over. Other times, he was brilliant. Those nights when the pain and the art aligned perfectly, when his brokenness was the instrument and the music was just what happened when he played it. Fans didn't know whether to worry or worship. He was giving them these perfect, devastating songs, but he looked like he was dying making them. Like every performance cost him something he couldn't afford to keep paying. In 2001, he tried to quit heroin, got clean, stayed clean for months. Started writing again, working on what would become From a Basement on the Hill. The songs coming out of him were stranger, darker, more experimental. He was trying to push past the acoustic singer-songwriter box people had put him in, but sobriety was its own kind of hell. The feelings he'd been medicating came back with compound interest. Depression so heavy he couldn't get out of bed, anxiety that made leaving his apartment feel impossible, the constant sense that he was fundamentally broken in ways that no amount of therapy or medication or love could fix. He relapsed, got clean again, relapsed. The cycle became its own kind of prison. Each time he got clean, he'd write brilliant music but feel terrible. Each time he used, he'd feel nothing but create nothing. There was no winning. There was just the endless back and forth between two kinds of unbearable. By 2003, Elliott was living in Los Angeles in an Echo Park apartment that friends described as increasingly chaotic. Walls covered in post-it notes with lyrics, recording equipment everywhere, empty bottles, full ashtrays. The detritus of someone who'd given up on appearing functional and just let the mess be visible. He was working on finishing From a Basement on the Hill, but progress was slow. He'd record, delete, record again. Nothing was good enough. Or everything was good enough and nothing mattered. He couldn't tell anymore. His girlfriend at the time, Jennifer Chiba, was worried. His friends were worried. His family was worried. But Elliott insisted he was fine, that he just needed to finish the album, that once it was done, everything would make sense again. On October 21st, 2003, Elliott and Jennifer had an argument. She went to take a shower. When she came out, she found Elliott in the kitchen with 2 stab wounds to the chest. He said her name once, then collapsed. The paramedics arrived fast, but it didn't matter. The wounds were too deep, too precise. One had gone straight through his heart. By the time they got him to the hospital, Elliott Smith was gone. The note was found on the kitchen counter. "I'm so sorry, love, Elliott. God forgive me." But forgive him for what? The official ruling was possible suicide, but the case was never truly closed. The wounds suggested someone else could have been involved. The lack of hesitation marks was unusual for suicide. The angle of the stabs was difficult to self-inflict. Jennifer Chiba wasn't charged, but suspicion lingered. Some friends believed he was murdered. Others believed he'd killed himself, and the evidence was just unfortunately ambiguous. His family chose to believe he'd gone in his own way, in silence. But maybe the real question isn't what happened in that kitchen. Maybe it's why Elliott Smith, who'd written hundreds of songs about wanting to disappear, chose to exist at all. Why someone in that much pain kept creating, kept touring, kept trying to connect even when connection felt impossible. The answer might be in the music itself. Every song Elliott wrote was a message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean hoping someone drowning would find it and realize they weren't alone. He wasn't trying to save himself. He'd long since given up on that. He was trying to save everyone else, or at least let them know that drowning was normal, that millions of people were doing it quietly, that you could make art from the sinking. Did his death mark the end of his story? Or was it the inevitable conclusion to a life spent turning pain into beauty until there was nothing left but the pain? After Elliott died, something strange happened. His music didn't fade. It grew. From a Basement on the Hill was released posthumously in 2004, completed by his family and friends. It was messy, raw, unfinished in places, and somehow perfect. You could hear Elliott fighting with himself across every track, trying to find a way forward, failing, trying again. The memorials were unlike anything the music world had seen. Not celebrity funerals with calculated grief, but raw, organic outpourings of actual loss. In Portland, hundreds gathered outside clubs he'd played, singing his songs without microphones or amplification. Just voices, some in tune, most not, all broken. In Los Angeles, the wall outside Solutions Audio, where he'd recorded, became a shrine covered in lyrics, letters, flowers, and the simple repeated message, "You saved me." Fans shared stories about listening to Elliott during their darkest moments and feeling less alone, about his songs being the soundtrack to their survival, about how his willingness to be vulnerable gave them permission to feel their own pain without shame. Beck, who'd been friends with Elliott, said, "He was the only artist who could make sadness sound safe, like it was okay to be broken, like broken was just another way of being whole." Fiona Apple, who'd toured with him, wrote, "When Elliott hugged you, you felt like the world stopped being cruel for a minute. He carried so much hurt, but he was gentle with other people's. That's rare. That's holy. The conspiracy theories about his death persisted. Internet forums debated evidence, angles, possibilities. Some people needed it to be murder because suicide felt like he'd abandoned them. Others needed it to be suicide because that meant he'd finally found peace, that he'd made a choice on his own terms. But Jennifer Chiba maintained her story. Elliott had been unstable, had threatened suicide before, had stabbed himself while she was in the other room. The police found no evidence of struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing that definitively proved murder. Just a note, 2 wounds, and a man who'd spent his entire life singing about not wanting to be here anymore. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than any conspiracy. Elliott Smith was in unimaginable pain, had been for years, and on October 21, 2003, that pain won. However it happened, whether he inflicted the wounds himself or someone else did, the result was the same. The music stopped, the whisper ended, and the world got a little bit louder, a little bit crueler because the one person who'd been brave enough to sing quietly was gone. What remains is the catalog. 7 studio albums, hundreds of songs. And that voice, that fragile, wounded, heartbreakingly honest voice that sounds like it's coming from the next room, like Elliott's still there singing to himself, not knowing you're listening, not caring if you are. Every artist who whispers now owes him a debt they can't repay. His influence rippled outward. Every indie artist with an acoustic guitar and too many feelings owes something to Elliott. Not because he invented confessional songwriting, others were doing it decades before, but because he proved you could strip it down even further. No poetic distance, no metaphor protecting you from the meaning, just the raw nerve of feeling set to melody. Phoebe Bridgers cites him constantly. Conor Oberst grew up on his music. Bon Iver's Justin Vernon has said his breakthrough album wouldn't exist without Elliott's blueprint for turning isolation into art. But Elliott's legacy isn't just musical, it's emotional. He created a template for how to talk about depression, addiction, suicidal ideation, not by making it romantic or glamorous, but by making it mundane, by showing that you can be deeply mentally ill and still be kind, still show up, still create, that your pain doesn't make you special, it just makes you human. The wall in Los Angeles, the Elliott Smith wall, is still there, still covered in messages. Some from old fans, some from people who discovered him years after his death. XO and You Saved Me and I Wish I Could Have Saved You, written over and over in different handwriting, different languages, all saying the same thing. You mattered. Your quiet voice reached us, we heard you. There's a poetry to it. Elliott, who spent his life trying to be invisible, becoming immortal through his very invisibility. His songs work because they sound like secrets, and secrets once shared create bonds stronger than spectacle ever could. In his wallet when he died, police found an old photograph. Elliott smiling, genuinely smiling, surrounded by friends at a party years earlier. On the back, in his handwriting, "It was a good day." That's the tragedy. That there were good days. That Elliott had moments of joy and connection and feeling okay. But they weren't enough. Or they were enough, but the bad days were worse. Or maybe after years of fighting, he was just tired of fighting. We'll never know for certain what happened in that kitchen. But we know what happened in the years before. A sensitive kid learned to turn his pain into art so perfect it hurt to hear. A quiet voice found an audience of millions who were also quiet, also hurting, also whispering in the dark, hoping someone would hear. Elliott Smith didn't write sad songs, he wrote honest ones, and honesty, it turns out, is sadder than any fiction. He spent 34 years proving that vulnerability could be strength, that whispers could echo farther than screams, that you could sing about wanting to die and somehow keep living. Keep creating, keep offering your broken heart to anyone who needed to know they weren't alone in their breaking. Music didn't save him. He always said it wouldn't. But the sound he made, that delicate, devastating sound, continues. In bedrooms and headphones and late-night drives, Elliott Smith is still singing. still speaking that secret language of pain that connects strangers across time and space. His gravestone in Portland reads, "He had a good sound." It's an understatement so profound it borders on poetry. Yes, Elliott Smith had a good sound. The way the ocean is wet, the way silence is quiet. He had a sound that changed music, that saved lives, that gave voice to the voiceless and made sadness something you could share instead of suffer alone. He left behind nothing loud, only the echo of honesty, which is the loudest sound there is. If truth hurts this much to tell, why do we keep asking our artists to survive it? And when a whisper outlives every scream, is silence still something to fear or something to follow?